Hey, welcome back to another workshop for the CPB Game Development Club. This is Lorenzo, and today we're going to be going over pixel animation. Today we're going to go over the principles of animation, how it applies to pixel art, and then we're going to create a short animation so that we can get you on track for creating your own animations. So, let's begin. So the first thing we're going to talk about are called the principles of animation. These were outlined by Disney animators Ollie Johnston and Frank Thomas back in 1981. These principles of animation lay the groundwork for all animation today, not just pixel animation. So when you're watching a new animated movie or a new anime, when you go through these things, you'll be able to recognize how they do it in their animation. So these principles of animation are squash and stretch, anticipation, staging, straight ahead action and pose to pose, follow through and overlapping action, ease in, ease out, arcs, secondary action, timing, exaggeration, solid drawing, and appeal. And I know this seems like a lot, and it really is because there's lots of things that go into animation. But just knowing a few of these things will help you get started on the right track, and we're going to talk about what each of these things are in the next slide. Okay, so here we have a GIF that goes into more detail about what the 12 principles of animation are, and I'm just going to briefly describe what each one is. So the first one is squash and stretch, and this is generally the most important principle of animation. So what squash and stretch describes is that when an object is in motion, you want to squash and stretch it so that it has the illusion of weight and volume and density and all those things. So the most common example that's used when people are picking up animation is of course a ball that's bouncing. When it's going upwards, you stretch the ball out to show the force being applied on it, and when it hits the ground, of course it squashes down when it hits the ground like a real physical object. So remembering these things while animating will really help whatever you're animating come to life and really make the audience believe that it actually has real volume and weight. The second thing is timing and motion. So there's lots of different timings that you can use for your animation that we'll go over later, but generally the less drawings you have, the quicker it'll be, and it'll be more snappy, and then the more drawings you have, it'll be really fluid. Next is anticipation. It says right there it's preparation for action. Basically, before anyone does an action, you of course want there to be something that signifies that they're about to do it. For example, if you're going to jump, what do you have to do before you jump? You have to squat down and bend your knees. That would be your anticipation before you jump. Or if we're talking about a video game character, if you're going to punch something, you can't really punch someone if you're just standing straight up and then instantly punch. It'll look really weird and awkward and look like it has no force behind it. So what do you do in anticipation? You wind back your arm before you punch. So that's what anticipation means in animation. Next is staging. So staging just talks about using motion to guide the viewer's eyes so that it's readable for the audience. That one's not going to be super applicable to you guys right now for pixel animation, but it's always important to remember. Next is follow through and overlapping action. So this really sells the animation by having secondary parts of the animation move even when like the main object stops moving. So like an example of this would be if you're running and you come to a stop, your hair would still be moving even though you're stopped. So that would be the follow through and overlapping action. It just sells more of the motion by showing that separate parts of the object can move independently. Next is straight ahead and pose to pose action. So this describes two different ways of tackling animation. Straight ahead is where you start with the very first frame and then you draw the next frame and you continue doing that until you get to the very end of the frame. The other way to do it is called pose to pose, where you do the first frame, the last frame, and then the important frames in between, and then you fill out the rest. So that's good for like when you're like blocking out important details for your animation to make sure you really get the important poses. Both ways have different benefits, and then you might want to use both methods depending on what you want to do. Next is slow in and slow out. So this talks about how things need to generally accelerate and decelerate when they're moving. So when you're in a car, right, if you're stopped and you want to get up to 60, you don't instantly just go straight up to 60. Your car slowly accelerates first and then reaches the speed. And when you're slowing down, you can't just instantly stop because that's not how physics work. So you slowly come down to a stop. So you want to include more frames at the beginning, at the end, and the end of your animation to show that you're slowing up or slowing in and out. Next is arcs, and this basically just means that we want objects to move in arcs, which gives them better flow and it's more natural for people to see things in arcs. Next is exaggeration. So another key thing about animation is that if you make it too realistic, it can look really static and dull. So we want to use exaggeration to really create more dynamic animations. As you can see in the GIF here, the ball is being really stretched in a way that like physically wouldn't really seem natural in real life, but it seems super natural in animation because it really sells the movement of what's going on. Next is secondary action. This is like any action that's happening in the back or separate from the main action that just helps to continue to sell the movement. Like if things are moving in the background due to like the force of the main action, that would be secondary action. Last two are solid drawing and appeal. They're kind of not super, they're not super into like techniques of animation, but solid drawing describes how you need to have the basics or a good understanding of how 3D drawing works so that things have the right proportions when you're animating them. No matter how cool your animation is, if like the proportions are wrong or like the background like looks too small compared to the character, then things will look off. And last is appeal. So you want to include the personality of your character so that they feel more like a real person rather than just like an object that's moving. So you want to an example of this would be how like different characters attack in video games. Like a lot of times they'll have different styles to the way they move or the way that they attack other people. So all of these things are super important for animation, and it's gonna take a long time for anyone to learn all of this stuff. You could do a masterclass of all of these principles of animation. But since we're all beginning here, it's just important to know what each thing is and consider how they can better aid in your animation. Okay, so if you're beginning and you're really like, man, there's so many principles that I have to remember and think about, and I don't know where to get started, I'm just going to talk about the few that I think are the most important at first, and then we can gradually grow to incorporate the other things more and more as we go on. So of course, the first one is squash and stretch. This is, like I said, the most important principle of animation, and it's just the thing you want to basically remember most when going into animation. Animation is all about selling movement through different frames of animation, and the way to sell that movement is to really stretch the characters in ways that wouldn't really happen in real life, but because it's happening so fast in animation, it's able to sell the movement and the power behind the movement really well. Next, that's also important to remember is anticipation. This is something that's easy to forget sometimes. Like how you want, like there have been times where I want to work like on the cool flashy part of like the sword swing that I'm really trying to animate, but then I remember that it looks weird that because he just goes straight into the sword swing without any anticipation. Anticipation is just as important as the move that follows it, because you can have different types of anticipation. If there's a long anticipation, it shows like your character is really winding up for the action that he's about to do. If it's a fast anticipation, it still sells the movement, but it shows that, or it could show that the character is really light on their feet or it's really quick. So anticipation isn't just good for selling the motion, but it can also be used to convey character as well. Follow through and overlapping action. This really just enhances all of your animations by having things that continue to move in the back, even though, even if motion is stopped, it really sells the rest of the animation. What you can do is you can go through the main parts of the animation, and then afterwards we go back through the frames and then start to animate all the overlapping action. And last is exaggeration, which goes hand in hand with squash and stretch. We want to exaggerate the movement to a point where it's almost, or not almost, like it is like non-realistic most of the time. It depends on the style you're going for, of course, but most of the time we want to do that, because if you do things according to how it looks in real life, it looks really dull in animation. So let's get into how we can apply all these things and start animating right now. Okay, so now we're in Pascal, which is the free app we're going to be using during the workshop. I know there's lots of different apps that you can choose, specifically ones that are paid and free on Steam. I've seen a lot of people use Sprite, which I personally use, but that is paid on Steam. So for our purposes, I'm just going to be demonstrating our animation here in Pascal, but you could do it in whatever software you see fit. So I just drew our basic character here. I drew him up really quick, so it's not perfect, but he'll do the job for now. And his weapon right here is like a butcher's knife, and what I want to animate is him sort of taking a step forward and then doing a big, like, sweeping cut upwards. So some things I want to consider is that first we have to consider the movement itself, and we have to consider the anticipation before the movement. So he can't just swing automatically from this stance. If you look at the way he's standing, it's like a neutral stance, and he's not really going to be able to swing with a good amount of power, at least to sell the animation from this stance. So what we're going to want to do is have him move in a way that makes us anticipate the strike. Okay, so I'm going to draw that right now, but before I do, I'm just going to show you some basic parts about Pascal. So here are your palettes on the right. You can import them by creating new palette, and then you can import from file. We'll be showing you how to do that in the workshop, or if you've already done the workshop, I'm sure you know how to do it. And then you can resize your canvas here. We're going with 32 by 32 since this is kind of a detailed character, and it's going to be a little bit of a bigger animation, but feel free to start smaller, like 16 by 16 or 8 by 8, just to start off with. And then here are some tools that you could use to like transform the image, like flipping them or transitioning them. And then here are some of the tools that you can use on the side: the paint bucket, the pen, the eraser, the most basic ones. And then rectangle, you can create a rectangle. M is just to move around. Oh, didn't want to do that. You can do Control Z to undo. And then this one I really like. If you could highlight parts of your drawing, and if you hold Shift, you can like move that part of the drawing around. Oh, okay. And then there's actually a dithering tool here. So, oh, I am on not a good color. So you can use the dithering tool to do dithering, like I talked about in the slides. And there's a color picker, and you can lighten and darken pixels. So I'm gonna draw the next pose, and then we're gonna talk about that in just a bit. Okay, so I've drawn the next pose, which is this one. So what did I do between the poses? Oh, I accidentally deleted it. So the first thing I did actually was I duplicated the frame so I wouldn't have to redraw everything again. But and then I just modified things from there. But if you don't want to do that, there's actually an onion skin. So an onion skin shows you the last frame that you did. So since I'm on frame 2, it would show me the frame 1, since that's the one that came before it. And then you could draw based on that. So I said this frame was going to be the anticipation frame. So he takes a step forward and pulls and like brings the sword back to like wind up for the swing. So here we're using the principle of anticipation to show how he's preparing for his movement by like contorting his body forward so that he gains or builds up more power, or at least gives the illusion of doing so. And another thing I want to talk about before we continue with the animation is actually this right here, which is the animation player, which could actually pop up like this. And this just shows like the frames on loop, and you could actually change the speed of your animation. So if you do it to 6, it'll be a lot slower. If you go to 24, it'll be really fast. Like I said before, depending on the number of frames you have, the smoother your animation will be. A good speed, I would say, is either 12 or 6. 6 is slower, but it's a good speed if you want to have more of a choppy animation, which has its own merits. So after this anticipation frame, we're going to go into the main movement, which is the swing. Okay, so the next frame that I already drew is the actual swing. So rather than drawing every single frame of the knife moving along like this arc that I want it to travel, that'll take way too long, and since it's so many frames, it'll look really smooth. It can be kind of jarring if it's that smooth. So what we do actually is we take the whole motion and put it into one motion or one object, and we call this actually a smear frame. So a smear frame is taking a fast motion and turning it into one object rather than animating all of the frames that go in between. And this actually is a style that is used a lot in pixel games. I'm sure if you've played pixel art games, you've seen this before, albeit briefly. But this is a way of like cutting costs and also adding a stylistic effect to your animation. And last but not least, we're going to do the last frame, which is the follow through. So we can't just have the swing and just have it end like this, because we want there to feel like this action like left an impact. So we want him to like pause a bit at the top to show his like follow through of the motion. So I'm going to do that right now. Okay, so I drew the last frame. If we compare it to the old one, we see that he moved a little bit backwards just to show that he's like really bringing the knife all the way back up. And we're using other principles of animation, but of squashing and stretching. So I didn't really go over this before, but he's squashing down in this frame to like build up power, and at the last frame he's really squishing his body, or like extending it to show that he's using his full extension to gain the most power out of his swing. So if we look in the animation player, I'd say it looks pretty good. It's a little choppy, but that's because we did mostly the keyframes. You can always go back and add more frames in between, or you could also speed up the FPS so that if you want it to be a faster swing, you can do that. But it does feel a little bit dull. So what you can actually do is change the timing of the frames. So there's different ways to do this. On like a Sprite, I'm pretty sure you can like actually change the amount of time that a certain frame takes up. But the really simple way to do it is to like duplicate a frame. So let's say I really want him to charge up his swing before he takes it. So I want his anticipation to be a little bit longer than it is. I could just duplicate the frame so that if you look in the animation, he pauses a little bit longer before he takes the swing, so that his anticipation really sells the motion a little bit more. So changing the timing, like we said in the principles, is important also to making your animation flow. you could always play around with things. Like maybe I want the swing to be really long, so I added 2 extra frames, and that looks a little bit off, so we'll get rid of one of the frames. I still think it looked better with just 1 frame, because the smear is not really something you're supposed to see fully, so I think it's fine leaving it as 1 frame. Maybe we can duplicate the ending frame so that it really sells the motion. Like he has to, it took such a toll on his body that he has to leave his knife in the air for that long. So that's how we apply the principles of animation to our own pixel animations. And of course, don't be discouraged if you can't like make something like this right from the get-go. I'm definitely not super good pixel artist. I just have some more experience, and I know like what kind of things I should be doing with the posing and such to really sell the motion. So pixel art is all about practice and more practice and more practice. So use these tips and continue to improve your animations. One other thing that I forgot to mention when I was talking over the anticipation frame is an easy way, rather than just redrawing everything, was to move certain things that you wanted to be moved to like sell the anticipation. So specifically, if we look at the onion skin, we see the standing pose that he was in before, and in anticipation I wanted him to take a step forward and lean forward. So what I did actually is I just highlighted his head with the rectangle selection tool, held shift, and then moved it forward to the position that I wanted it. I did the same with the knife. I wanted it to be further back and further down to show him crouching down. So I selected that and moved it further down, and then that'll help you with gaining reference as to where to draw the rest of the parts of his body. Same goes for stretching as well. Like if you want to take parts of the body and move them higher up, you can move them like that, or you could just straight redraw them, which is more time consuming but probably looks better in the end. This is just the fast way I did it, since I'm just making a simple animation for this video. Okay, so the very last thing we're going to talk about is how we actually use these animations in our games. So when you have an animation, you see that it's split into different frames. And the way to actually use these frames and create animations is that you create a sprite sheet out of them. So a sprite sheet is just a single image that contains all the frames in an animation. So in Pascal, how to do that, you go to export, and then PNG, and then there's Sprite file export. You see here that it ups the resolution to 64. I'm just gonna leave that as it is, so it'll be a little bit bigger. It'll be easier to work with. So you see that you can set the columns and the rows. So you'll have 6 frames and 2 columns and 3 rows. So if we download that, it'll give us our sprite sheet. So this is what a sprite sheet looks like. It's a little blurry because the frames we did are pretty small. It's like 64 by 64 pixels. But I'll show you really quick how to put that into Unity. So here we are in Unity, and this is just a test scene that I created. So first we're going to need, of course, an object that we're going to put the sprite onto. So let's just call this object guy. And guy, he doesn't have anything in him, so let's add a sprite renderer so he can actually use a sprite. So I already did this part already, but you can simply just take your download and drag and drop, and then it would put the sprite into your folder where everything in Unity is stored. So you can take the sprite that we made. Hold on. Okay, it's this one that I'm supposed to be looking at. So we could take the sprite that we made and put it into the sprite renderer, and we see that it renders as the whole sprite sheet and not the single sprite. So what we need to do is actually click on the sprite that we want to use, and we're going to need to turn it into multiple sprites. So since there's a 2D sprite first, the first thing we want to do is look at filter mode and do point, and then go to compression and do none. That just makes make sure the sprites look fine. And what we're really going to change is go to sprite mode here and change it from single to multiple. And this will let us split the sprite sheet into multiple sprites. So to do that, we can go to the sprite editor, click apply, and in the top left there's a slice option. There is an automatic slice, but since the sprites have, or the different frames have different sizes, it'll slice it into different size pieces, which we don't want. So you could either do it by cell size or by cell count. By cell count, you would do like I have 3 rows, 2 columns. You would write that down. So you have 2 rows, 3 columns, and you can slice that and it'll cut it like that, which is fine. But we also know our cell size, and I said earlier they got upscaled to let's revert this before so you could see the changes. We knew the cell size, it got upscaled to 64 by 64. If we do that, it'll cut in the same way. So you want to hit apply, and now it'll be split into lots of different sprites. So if you go back, we can see that because there'll be this little expand icon, and it'll show all the different sprites that are inside this animation. So if we go back to Guy, we can put the idle sprite in here, and there we go. The camera is a little bit big for our guy, so we can change the size to like 1. Or if you don't want to change the camera size, you can go to the sprite and change the pixels per unit, but be careful with this because of course you want all the characters to have the same pixels per unit. So if you change it in one place, you got to change it everywhere. So if we play the game, we can see, well, the sprite is a single sprite now, but that's not really what we wanted. We wanted a whole animation. So what we need to do is we need to go here, or we need to go back to our guy and add an animator component. And to create the animation, we're going to go to Window, Animation, and then Animation again. And then we're going to create a new animation. So let's call this animation Attack. And what you can simply do is just drag and drop the sprite sheet into here. Oh, sorry, don't do that. You have to expand it first, and then select all the frames that you want, and then you have to drag and drop in there. So if we play it, you can see that he's swinging really, really, really fast. So it's definitely not playing at the speed we want. So what we can do is we can just, if you select all of them by using Shift, you could change the time it takes for the animation to complete. So if we play it now, it looks much more natural. And if we go to play, it'll play the animation. And then of course you can use the animator and set it to certain triggers, like if you press a button, do this animation, but that's a topic for a different time. So yeah, thank you for watching the workshop on pixel animation. And of course, keep practicing. And if you ever have questions, feel free to ask in our Discord if you need like advice or like feedback on any pixel animation you do. And if there's a specific type of animation that you want to do, you can reach out to me or any of the board, or even in like our art channel, and I'm sure I can help you out to find the resources you need to get your animation rolling. Well, thanks for everything, guys. Get out there and start animating. Thank you. Oh, and one last thing. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also hit the bell. I spent a lot of time in this video. Thanks. Have a good weekend.